بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه والتابعين لهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين أما بعد. Welcome to another lesson on Waraqat. Inshallah, today we'll be picking up our discussion on al-awamir wal-nawahi, commands and prohibitions. And I just want to sort of recap what we discussed about commands and prohibitions last week, so we can build on those discussions. Inshallah, today's lesson will be short because we'll just be looking at commands and prohibitions. I know last week's discussion, it got a little bit complicated, so for those who are present, as well as for those who might be watching online, I want to make sure that you don't get lost. So just to briefly recap, Imam al-Juwayni, he says, Al-amru istida'u al-fi'l bil-qawl mimman huwa dunahu ala sabil al-wujub. Command is a verbal demand directed to an inferior, someone of lesser status, to do an action. وصيغته افعل. It's using the verb form افعل or its various equivalents. Basically, this is the command form, the imperative form of the verb. So you say افعل, qum, stand, aqim as-salah, establish the prayer, so forth. This is, this is known in grammar, the English term is the imperative form, So this is the primary form that commands take. We have if'al, do, for commands, and la taf'al, do not do, for verbs. So you have commands and take the form if'al. Commands take the form if'al. Prohibitions take forms such as لا تفعل, do not do. وهي عند الإطلاق والتجرد عن القرينة تحمل عليه. وهي عند الإطلاق والتجرد عن القرينة تحمل عليه. Meaning, in other words, when you have simply the command by itself and there is nothing in the words of the text to qualify it, or there is no other indications present that would indicate, whether that be external evidences or otherwise, that would indicate that this is intended to be a recommendation, or that this is actually intended to be simply giving permission. The default rule is the command is interpreted as an obligation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, aqim as-salah, that means establish the prayer. This command is an obligation. It's not a recommendation. This command is an obligation. It is an obligation to perform the prayer. Atu zakat, this command is an obligation to give the zakat. So this is the default rule. This is how commands are understood by default. When there is other evidence, it's known as a qarina. Qarina is not evidence in the sense of it has to be, a hadith or an ayah. A qarina could be that there is some accompanying indication in the text or a meaning that is present that indicates that this command is not intended to be an obligation. So an example we mentioned of that is, many of the things that are recommendations are simply adab. They're adab. They're etiquettes that the Prophet ﷺ is teaching. So, for example, you have the command to dye your hair. So if your hair turns white, we've been commanded to dye it. This is pretty much by agreement a recommendation. It's a recommendation. The Prophet ﷺ is encouraging us to do this. He's not obligating us to do this. So and the reason is because this is an adab. It's an adab. It's not something that is essential and binding. So when there is a textual evidence present, or there is a meaning present, or there is some subtle indication in the text itself that obligation is not intended, then the command is understood according to this alternative meaning, such as nadb or ibaha, that this is simply something that is recommended or it is mubah. So this is the fundamental principle. As we mentioned last week, this principle, al-Amr yufid al-wujub, or al-Amr Mutlaq yufid al-wujub, that the default state is commands are understood to be obligations. This is the popular view across the four madhabs. This is the popular view across the four madhabs. You find majority of Malikis, majority of Shafi'is, majority of Hanafis, majority of Hanbalis. In each madhab, you have the majority of scholars. This is the view that they went with. And oftentimes you might find in books of the madhab or books of the usul of each given madhab that the scholars of the madhab, sometimes in some of these books, they might not even mention another opinion. So this is very much the popular view. This is very much the popular view. I mentioned last week that there is, however, an ikhtilaf concerning this. And that there is a minority of scholars across the four madhabs who took some other views. There's actually a host of different views, but the most important view that concerns us is the view that this is actually mushtarak between wujub and nadb, meaning it's equal. Wujub and nadb are equal as meanings of the command form. So when you have a command, it could equally mean obligation or nadb, and a qarina is necessary to determine which one is intended. There's another opinion similar to this. This is actually the opinion of Imam al Ghazali. Imam al Ghazali in al-Mustasfa. Al Ghazali in al-Mustasfa argues that we do not know what is the default. Basically, he takes a position of tawaqquf. We don't know what is the default. To determine that something is the default, we would have to make a determination that originally in the Arabic language, it was intended for one of these things. Either it was intended to be default for wujub, or it was intended default for nadb, or it was intended default, that it's a default ruling is actually that it's mushtarak. We don't know this to be the case. We don't know this to be the case. We don't have any evidence, rational or transmitted, that would show that this is how this form was originally coined by the Arabs for this particular purpose. So we don't know. In effect, this is the same as saying, the practical effect of this is basically the same as saying that they're mushtaq, wujub or nadb. So it could be either or. So the end result of Imam al Ghazali's qawl is also that with any command, if'al, do this action, do that action, establish the prayer, give the zakah, make a mukataba contract, ashhidu idha tabayatum, take have witnesses bear testimony when performing a financial transaction, that each and every single one of these cases has to be looked at individually to look what does the evidence favor. What does the evidence favor? Now, it's worth pointing out that Imam al Ghazali, of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, Imam al Ghazali is a famous and extremely important scholar of usul fiqh. His book Al-Mustasfa is one of the authoritative works in the madhab. You see me looking around, it's because I'm trying to find my copy of Al-Mustasfa, which I seem to have misplaced. It is one of the authoritative works in the field. It's one of the fundamental works in the field. So he's extremely important as a scholar of usul fiqh for the field in its entirety, not just for his own madhab, but in the field in its entirety. Kitab al-Mustasfa is a deeply influential work. In his madhab, it's a deeply influential work. Across the madhabs, it is a deeply influential work. There is more than one Maliki scholar has done a summary of al-Mustasfa. Ibn Qudama, the famous Hanbali scholar, who is a very important Hanbali authority, has written his own work on Hanbali usul fiqh that is actually based on and summarized from al-Mustasfa. Rawdat al-Nadhir. Rawdat al-Nadhir is one of the famous texts in the madhab that is frequently studied and is one of the important and well-known works in the Hanbali madhab. So he's an extremely important and influential scholar in the field of usul fiqh. What's more, he is equally important for his contributions to Shafi'i fiqh, both in writing works expounding the fiqh of the madhab, so writing basically Assalamu alaikum. Can you guys hear me? Is the sound the same or the different, or is it different? I want to make okay, because I suspect that something happened with my microphone. Um, okay, so I have no idea where I cut off. Okay, so what was the last thing that you actually heard me saying? Okay, so Imam al Ghazali is extremely important in Shafi'i fiqh. He's an authority in Shafi'i fiqh who his contributions to Shafi'i fiqh include many works that are dealing with internal madhabi fiqh, the fiqh of the madhab, as well as works of khilaf, where he's defending the positions of the madhab from differing opinions. So, for example, he has a book that has recently been published in this genre, Tahsin al-Ma'akhid, which basically is defending the Shafi'i positions. So he's an authority in the Shafi'i madhab, in fiqh and in usul. Yet, I don't think that his positions, if we were to look at how he's understood commands and how he's some of them to be obligatory and some of them to be mandub, I don't think that we would find that his positions are radically different. I don't think we would find that his positions are radically different from the rest of the Shafi fuqaha as a result of this principle. And the reason is because this principle, although according to this principle, we were saying the default is that commands are understood to be obligatory. We only resort to this default when we have exhausted all qara'in. If there's a qarina indicating wujub, then it doesn't matter what the default is. If there's a qarina indicating nadb, it doesn't matter what the default is. It's when we've looked, or if there's qara'in for both sides, we have to weigh them. If there are qara'in, there are indications that tip the scale in favor of obligation, and other indications that would seem to tip the scale in favor of nadb. We have to look at them and weigh them and see which are weightier. And we might differ on that. Individual fuqaha might differ on that. Some of them might feel that the qara'in for wujub are weightier. Some of them might feel the qara'in for nadb are heavier and favor one or the other. But in this case, you would only resort to the default. When you find no qara'in, or when you find qara'in, but you don't feel that the qara'in on this side are heavier or weightier than the qara'in on the other side. They're basically equal, and so you're looking at the default. So, according to the view that Imam al Ghazali has taken, to make a conclusion, you would have to find qara'in. You cannot make a determination that it is wujub or nadb except based on qara'in. But according to this more popular view, al-amr yufidul wujub, in the absence of qara'in, or if the qara'in are felt to be equal, then you resort to the default. The fact that these scholars, such as Imam al Ghazali, who have taken this sort of approach, where qara'in become necessary, don't radically differ from the other fuqaha in their interpretations of the commands and prohibitions, is an indication that most commands inevitably will have various qara'in, various evidences, whether those be textual evidences or rational deduction, ta'lil, looking at the meaning and the purpose and function of the commands that will indicate what is intended. They'll indicate what is intended. So the cases in which you would be forced to resort to looking at what is the default would then be limited. And so then it's natural that the difference on this principle doesn't have a radical impact on the actual applications, because its application then is somewhat limited. Is that clear? Does everyone understand what I'm saying? Why that would be, why the applications would be limited? I just want to make sure that everyone is following. Okay. All right. So this is, basically in a nutshell what we had covered last week. Hopefully, everyone is clear on it. Muhammad Abdul Munam asks a question. I'll just answer it because it's directly related to this point, and then we'll move on quickly. Basically, what Imam al Ghazali was arguing was that the tawaqquf is between nadb and wujub, not ibaha. Ibaha is a meaning that it's used for, but it's a majazi meaning. As for between nadb and wujub, it's not possible to make a determination whether the default linguistic meaning, the wada, in other words. You remember we talked about wada and when we talked about haqiqa and majaz. The wada of sighat al-amr, we cannot make a determination whether it was wujub or nadb or the two together, ishtirak between wujub and nadb. So wujub and nadb equally. And he says we can't make a determination for one of these three because we simply don't have the means to make that determination, that the original wada, the original coinage by the Arabs of this expression of this form, the imperative form, that originally it was default for this or for this or for this. And since we cannot make that determination, he says we must make tawaqquf. There's long discussions that need to be had concerning this because of the idea of wada and what have you that are beyond our concern. Okay, so moving along, Imam al-Juwayni says, ولا يقتضي التكرار على الصحيح. The correct opinion is that the command, meaning sighat if'al, the imperative form, does not dictate, it does not require repetition. So when a command is given, all that is required is that you perform that command. And if you performed it a single time, you will fulfill the command. But if you have evidence, when you have evidence that repetition is intended, then obviously that indicates the need for repetition. Like for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أقم الصلاة لدلوك الشمس. Establish the prayer whenever the sun reaches its zenith. Or whenever the sun passes its zenith. This is basically the Dhuhr time. Obviously, this is a recurring event. And because it's been tied to this sabab, which is recurring, then you have to repeat it. Every time the sun passes its zenith, Dhuhr prayers do. Another example, when kuntum junuban fattahharu. If you are in a state of janaba, state of ritual impurity, the major ritual impurity, then purify yourselves, meaning take a bath. So every time you enter a state of janaba, you must make ghusl. وَالسَّارِقُ وَالسَّارِقَةُ فَقَطَّعُوا أَيْدِيَهُمَا. The thief, both male and female, cut their hands. So anytime you find a thief, because there are other conditions that are known from other texts and from other evidences. When those conditions are met, the thief's hand must be cut. It doesn't mean that, we cut one thief's hand, and that's it. The obligation is fulfilled. Or, the very first time I became junub, I made ghusl, and so, I've fulfilled the command. These commands are tied to a sabab that is recurring, and every time the sabab recurs, the requirement to perform this action recurs. So al-Amr Mutlaq. Remember, we talked about al-Amr Mutlaq with regards to obligation. That basically, when there's not accompanying evidence, when there's not accompanying indications, this is called al-Amr Mutlaq. So al-Amr Mutlaq la yaqtadi at-taqrar. But there are awamir that indicate taqrar because they're accompanied by evidences that indicate this. Then he says, وَلَا يَقْتَضِ الْفَوْر. Also a command, when you have, Allah gives a command saying, do such and such action. This does not require immediate action. The reason is basically that the command is an instruction to do this action. But unless it's stated otherwise, it has not specified a time for the performance of that action. And so the action does not have to be performed immediately. The obligation does not have to be an immediate action. This is وَلَا يَقْتَضِ الْفَوْرِ. Sometimes you'll find some of the fuqaha, some of the usuliyin, they will express this issue as يَقْتَضِ التَّرَاخِي, that al-amr yaqtadi at-tarahi, meaning the command indicates that you have a lengthy period of time, you have the right to delay. It's more precise to say al-amr la yaqtadi al-fawr. It simply does not require immediate action, but it doesn't mean so therefore go ahead and delay it. It's not telling you what time to do it. The command itself, when someone says do this action, unless there is some indication of the time that it needs to be done immediately, or that it doesn't need to be done immediately, or that you have an extended period of time to do it, it doesn't tell you anything about the time. So this is basically the idea here. So this is the opinion that Imam al-Juwayni has taken. There is an ikhtilaf on this. Some of the fuqaha, some of the usuliyin say that al-amr yaqtadi al-fawr. Al-amr yaqtadi al-fawr. That a command, when it is given, meaning al-amr al-mutlaq, a command when it is given, unless indicated otherwise, requires immediate action, requires immediate performance. In this particular point, in the text, some of the manuscripts have an addition that basically explain this idea. They say they have a sentence that I suspect, I didn't include it here in the text because I suspect that it's actually coming from commentary. Even though Ibn al-Firkah, in his commentary on al-Waraqat, he includes this as part of the text. But I suspect that what has happened is the copy that he had, that what was originally an explanatory note in the margins was mistakenly moved by some scribes inside the text. Although it's not a major issue, but Wallahu Alam, I think that most likely this is commentary and it's not actually from the text of Imam al-Juwayni. He says, لأن الغرض منه إيجاد الفعل من غير اختصاص بالزمان الأول دون الزمان الثاني. He says, why does it not indicate immediate action? Why does a command not require immediate action? He says, because the purpose of the command, meaning a command by itself, in and of itself, unless it indicated otherwise, its purpose is that you should perform this action without specifying that it has to be done immediately at the beginning of the time rather than at a later time. So a time has not been specified. This is, in other words, the command is simply saying this action must be performed. There's nothing in the command itself or the expression, do this action, that indicates a required time frame or a particular time, whether that be now or later. So the discussion here then is once again about Amr Mutlaq, meaning the expression for the command expression, do such and such act, in and of itself, without other accompanying indication. Because if you have other accompanying indications that indicate that the act must be performed immediately, then it is obligatory to perform it immediately. And if you have other indications that the command is that you have an extended period of time to fulfill that command, then it's obligatory to perform at any time during the allowed time period. And the obligation then is not immediate. So this principle, again, it's about Amr Mutlaq. It's without other considerations. The sighat itself, the expression itself, what does it indicate? So according to Imam al-Juwayni here, it simply does not require a particular time frame. There's ikhtilaf about this. As I said, the popular view in the Hanbali madhab in particular is l-Fawr. And inshallah, we'll come back to this, but I want to actually take a look at this particular issue as a case study. So going on, Imam al-Juwayni says, وَالْأَمْرُ بِإِيجَادِ الْفِعْلِ أَمْرٌ بِهِ وَبِمَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْفِعْلُ إِلَّا بِهِ كالأمر بالصلاة فإنه أمر بالطهارة المؤدية إليها. Says the command to perform an action is a command to perform both that act itself and whatever is required for the completion of the act, whatever is necessary for the completion of the act. No, for Shafi'is, the famous view is Amr La Yaqtadi l-Fawr. So this is one of the usuli issues that Hanbalis and Shafi'is disagree on, at least according to the popular opinion of the two madhabs. So the popular opinion for Shafi'is is what Imam al-Juwayni has said here. Al-Amr La Yaqtadi l-Fawr, it does not require immediate action. For the Hanbalis, the popular opinion is Al-Amr Yaqtadi l-Fawr, it requires immediate action, meaning Al-Amr Mutlaq. So otherwise, there's no fuqaha, there's no usuliyin who consider all commands to require immediate action, and that all commands must be fulfilled immediately. Nor are there any, fuqaha or usuliyin who say that all commands are basically open-ended and you can perform them whenever you want. I think that's clear. There's nobody who says that, you can perform Salat al-Fajr whenever you feel like it. Because, our madhab is that Al-Amr La Yaqtadi l-Fawr kama qala Imam al-Haramain. So the discussion then is about Al-Amr Mutlaq. When you don't have the evidence, when you have evidence that indicates one or the other is intended, this is settled by that evidence. But how do you interpret the requirement that is present when you don't have those other evidences? This is the issue. This is the issue that is being discussed here. So in any case, Imam al-Haramain says the command to perform an action is a command to perform both the action and whatever is required for the completion of the action. So this is an example then he gives. The command to perform the prayer is a command enjoining purification, which is necessary for the prayer. So if Allah has commanded you to pray and you don't have wudu, prayer is not valid without wudu. So therefore, performing wudu is an obligation. And the command to perform the prayer in reality is also implicitly a command for those who are not in wudu to perform wudu. It's also implicitly a command for the person who does not have water to go get water. It's a command for the person whose aura is not covered to cover his aura. The aura of salah. So if his aura of salah is not covered, it's a command that he cover his aura, and so forth. Because it is because anytime you have a command for a particular action, it's also implicitly a command for what is the necessary for the fulfillment of that command. This is oftentimes referred to as the qaida ma la yatimmu al-wajibu illa bihi fahuwa wajib. Whatever is necessary for the fulfillment of a wajib is in and of itself wajib. It's and then he goes on to say وَإِذَا فُعِلْ يَخْرُجُ الْمَأْمُورُ عَنِ الْأُحْدَةِ. When the act is fulfilled, then the person to whom the command is addressed is released from from the obligation on him, from the charge that is laid upon him. So it's worth noting concerning this principle, مَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْوَاجِبُ إِلَّا بِهِ فَهُوَ وَاجِبٌ, that performing that which is necessary for the completion of an obligatory action is itself obligatory. There are precursors to wajib actions that are necessary for the action to be wajib. And there are certain precursors that are necessary for the action to be valid. Okay. So for example, the example that was given here with salah. Salah, to be valid, requires wudu. Salah to be valid requires wudu. Salah is an obligation. Zakah is also an obligation. But zakah is not an obligation on the person who does not possess a nisab. Right? So, the nisab in the nisab for zakah, I think in dollars terms, I'm not exactly sure the amount, but it comes out to a couple $1,000, something like that. It's not a really big amount, but basically, if you possess this amount, then you are eligible for, not eligible for, you are obligated to give zakah with certain conditions. So one of those conditions is that you must first possess a nisab. Nisab is the minimum amount of wealth that you must possess for you to be considered someone who is required to give zakah. So if you have less than that amount, no zakah is due from you. So this is a precursor to the obligation of zakah. But this is not a precursor to the validity, it's a precursor to the actual obligation itself. Meaning, zakah is not obligatory on you until you have an nisab. So you are not actually under any obligation. If I have $500 in my pocket, and that's all that I happen to have, and I'm doing fine, and I don't have any particular needs, and I don't have particular financial obligations that would necessitate that I go out and make more money, I'm under no obligation from the Sharia to collect enough money that it reaches a nisab. And that therefore I become bound to give zakah. So here, technically speaking, the nisab is necessary for the obligation of zakat, but it's necessary for the zakat to be obligatory. It's not actually obligatory on you. And so these sorts of precursors, it's not a requirement on you to actually attain. Similar to this is Hajj. Hajj perhaps is clear. Hajj is an obligation once in your lifetime. If you don't have the financial capability to perform Hajj, you're not actually, the obligation is not actually applicable to you. Now, suppose a person who doesn't have the financial capability to perform Hajj decides anyways that, I don't actually have any, financial means, but you know what, I'm going to go make Hajj this year. And he sets out on foot from Karachi or from Timbuktu or from wherever he happens to be going. Sets out on foot. And along the way, he makes do working odd jobs and things like that, finding somewhere or another to fulfill his expenses until he gets to Makkah and he performs the Hajj that year. His obligation is fulfilled. His obligation, if he performs the Hajj, his obligation of Hajjatul Islam is fulfilled. But it was not obligatory on him to actually perform the Hajj because he didn't have basically the finances that are typically necessary to perform Hajj. He was in a situation that Hajj is not actually obligatory on him. And so a person in this situation who does not have these financial means, if he says, I have enough to take care of my needs, or the job that I'm working, even though it gives me just a little bit, I'm taking care of my needs, I'm not saving anything, but I don't have any need, so I'm fine. There's no doubt that if this person with the niyyah of going to Hajj earns enough to be able to financially go for Hajj, that he would be rewarded for that niyyah, and that once he has enough money that he can afford to go to Hajj, that that obligation, that once in a lifetime obligation, would become from that point binding on him. But he's not actually under an obligation to do so. He's not under an obligation to do so. And the reality is, if we look at the situation today, obviously outside of Corona, on an annual basis, I think something like 3 million people make Hajj. 3 million people are making Hajj. Maybe 2 million. I'm not sure at the moment what the exact numbers are, but something like 3 million. And there is what now? At least over 1.5 billion Muslims. I'm not sure what the actual number is now. It might be more like 1.7 billion. For 1.7 billion people to make Hajj, or let's say 1.5 billion people to make Hajj on an annual basis, at a rate of, let's say, 3 million new Hujjaj every year. Obviously, we know not every single one of them is a new Hajj. It is new. Many of them are repeating Hajj. For that 3 million to perform Hajj at a rate, for that 1.5 billion to perform Hajj at a rate of 3 million every year, it would take like 500 years. So obviously, it's not going to happen. So the reality is that the majority of the Ummah will never actually be able to make Hajj. Never be actually able to make Hajj due to various reasons, financial limitations, other limitations that make it impossible for them to get a place to go for Hajj. So for the people who are in that situation where they're unable to go to Hajj, they're not actually under an obligation to say, I'm going to spend the next year or 5 years or 10 years working until I have enough money that I can go to Hajj. And I'm going to put all other expenses on the side and save as much as I can so that I can go to Hajj. They're not actually under an obligation to do that. So there's a difference between ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به, that which is necessary to fulfill a obligatory act, and ما لا يتم الوجوب إلا به, that which is necessary for an act to become obligatory. And again, with specific details or specific examples, there might be ikhtilaf amongst fuqaha looking at particular evidences. But as a matter of principle, there's a difference between something being a precursor for an action becoming obligatory on you and a precursor for fulfilling an action that is already obligatory on you. So he then goes on to say, he has a discussion under the heading, الذي يدخل في الأمر والنهي وما لا يدخل. This in different manuscripts is sort of expressed differently. He says, يدخل في خطاب الله تعالى المؤمنون. So Allah's address in the Quran, in the Sharia, applies to the believers. وأما الساهي والصبي والمجنون فهم غير داخلين في الخطاب. As for the person who is unaware and the child and the insane, the khitab is not applicable to them. The address of the Quran's teachings, the address of the Sharia's commandments and prohibitions is not applicable to them. والكفار مخاطبون بفروع الشريعة وبما لا تصح إلا به وهو الإسلام. لقوله تعالى حكاية عن الكفار ما سلككم في سقر قالوا لم نكن من المصلين. So the disbelievers, when it comes to the disbelievers, this is an issue of khilaf. There's a khilaf amongst the usuliyin. Does the khitab apply to the disbelievers? So before that, with the issue of the person who's unaware and the child and the insane, this is indicated by a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, رُفِعَ الْقَلَمُ عَنْ ثَلَاثَةٍ. The pen has been lifted from 3 people, meaning they're not accountable for their deeds. The sleeping person until he wakes up, because he doesn't know what he's doing. وَأَنِ السَّبِيء حَتَّى يَبْلُغ. The child until he reaches the age of maturity, the age of puberty. وَعَنِ الْمَجْنُونِ حَتَّى يَعْقِلْ. And the insane person until he is able to, until he is in his faculties. He has his faculties of reason, aql. So the following up from this, you have this issue. The kuffar, the disbelievers, commands of the Sharia dealing with the furu, commands of the Sharia dealing with the furu, which are the details of the Sharia, the specific ahkam, are applicable to them. So, there's no ikhtilaf amongst the usuliyin that the kuffar are bound. It is obligatory on them to enter into Islam. There's no ikhtilaf concerning this. It is an obligation that they must enter into Islam. And so we should address them with the message of Islam, and it is obligatory on them to enter into Islam, and they will be held accountable for whether or not they have accepted Islam. Where the usuliyin differ is, what about the furu'? The obligation to perform salah and zakah, etc. Is this obligation, or these actions, are they a binding obligation on them? So Imam al-Haramain here, he argues that the furu, these details of the ahkam of the Sharia that are performed after one enters into Islam, are also obligatory. They're also obligatory for the kuffar. Or at least they're accountable. They're accountable for these actions. So now, see, here in the text, he anticipates the objection that the kafir, his actions are invalid. So, for example, if he performs salah, his salah is invalid. His salah is invalid. So, he basically anticipating this objection, he says that they're obligated, they're bound by the commands concerning the furu, and also the precondition for the validity of this furu. Remember, we talked about with the example of tahara. You've been commanded to perform salah, you have to perform wudu. In this case, you've been commanded to perform salah, you have to take shahada. The command is there. The command to perform salah is applicable to them. And just like the person who is not in a state of tahara, he doesn't say, oh, it's Fajr time. Yeah, but I don't have wudu, so it's not obligatory. Maybe tomorrow, inshallah. So basically what he's saying is the fact that they're not Muslim doesn't mean that the commands are inapplicable to them. Doesn't mean the commands are inapplicable to them. Because they can become Muslim. Same way that, it's Fajr time, you can make wudu if you don't have wudu. Fine, you just woke up, you don't have wudu. Make wudu. It's not an excuse to say that, oh, well, I don't have wudu, so I don't have to pray today. The command to perform the prayer obviously doesn't apply just to people who are already in wudu. It applies to those who also are not in wudu. And just like the person who is not in wudu is capable of making wudu, the person who is not a Muslim is capable of taking the shahada. So the only difference practically the only difference between him and the person who's not in wudu is that he needs to first take the shahada and then perform the wudu, or if we obligate him to perform ghusl, he needs to perform the ghusl and then pray. And he quotes a textual evidence for this as بِقَوْلِهِ تَعَالَى حِكَايَةً إِنَّ الْكُفَّارِ, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about the disbelievers that it will be said to them, مَا سَلَكَكُمْ فِي سَقَرٍ, what has landed you in hell? They will say, لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ, we were not from those who performed the prayer. Now there are arguments surrounding this. Some of the ulama say, well, this doesn't really prove that that the actual prayer is an obligation on them, because al-musallin here could be meant intending, as sort of we were not Muslims, because this is the sign of the Muslim. Like, for example, when, as Muslims, we oftentimes refer to Muslims and the members of the Muslim Ummah as Ahlul Qibla, the people of the Qibla. Why? Because this is a sign that represents them. It's a sign that represents them. It doesn't mean that, someone who mistakenly prays away from the Qibla is not a Muslim anymore or something. It's just, it's a symbol that represents the Muslims. So they said, قَالُوا لَمْ نَكُ مِنَ الْمُصَلِّينَ, we were not from the Musallin, meaning we weren't Muslims. basically, we weren't Muslims. So this is a response to this argument. And then there's a counter response that, well, the verses go on to say, وَلَمْ نَكُ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ, we did not used to feed the poor person. وَكُنَّا نَخُوضُ مَعَ الْخَائِضِينَ, and we would engage in idle talk with those who also do so. So they said, well, لَمْ نَكُ نُطْعِمُ الْمِسْكِينَ here, what is wajib in terms of feeding the poor is zakah. So this is saying that they're accountable for this. So someone might ask, well, this creates a bit of a problem that when somebody becomes Muslim, we don't say, okay, well, you became baligh 17 years ago, yallah, we've got 17 years of prayers to make up. Now you have the shart, the precondition of salah is Islam. You fulfilled it. Now make up those prayers. So obviously by ijma, no one says that a new Muslim is required to make up years of prayer from all the years that he wasn't Muslim. Nobody says that. So those who said that the furu applied to the Kuffar basically said that this is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forgiven them. He's not going to take them to account for. But so now you might ask, okay, well, what is the point of this issue? What function does this usul fiqh issue actually serve? And so one of the points that is oftentimes made is that the significance of this issue is that the kafir, if he does not accept Islam, in the hereafter, he will be accountable for all these furu of the Sharia that he could have learned and practiced, but he didn't. On top of his refusal of Islam, he will be accountable for all of this as well, and so this will add to his punishment. There are also some other issues dealing specific actions of the kuffar, are they considered valid or not valid? Specific details concerning with dealing with what you're allowed to deal with the kuffar and not deal with the kuffar. There are certain fiqh rulings that some have derived from the ikhtilaf on this principle. But basically, this is what Imam al-Haramain is arguing here. But there's an interesting point concerning all of this idea of taklif. This notion of accountability. This is the Arabic term for this is taklif. Ibn al-Firkah, in the course of his discussion, he mentions a point. In the course of his discussion in this section, he mentions an important point. He says, Manat al-taklif al-aql. The basis of taklif is aql. It is your ability to reason, your ability, your mental faculties. And so the child is not accountable. I mean, with the insane person, it's obvious that he's not in his mental faculties, and so he's not accountable. Child might be in his mental capacity, but the mental capacity of a child is limited. And this is why a child is not accountable until he becomes baligh, until he reaches adulthood. Because for us, from the Shari'i perspective, essentially, bulugh is when the ahkam of adulthood are applicable. Although there are certain things that a child might have reduced legal capacity in terms of his ability to engage in financial transactions until it's shown that he's actually mature enough and experienced enough to do so, and other things like that. But this is the time at which, when it comes to matters of halal and haram, and obligation and sin, it begins to apply to the child. And this is from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that aql, that the child before that is not required to do this. And this actually reminds me of a story. This is a story from someone I know very well. As a young child, this is around age 8 or 9, looking around him and looking at the Muslim community around him where he was, he found that, most people seem to, at least, this is what he had observed of the community that was around him. Most people seem to not pray. And he thought, well, I'm just a young child. And growing up around people who are like this, I'm likely to end up like them. And, obviously what these people are doing, neglecting the salah, this is something that's very serious and it's haram. And they'll be accountable for this and, they could go to Jahannam. And, if this is the way that my community around me is, I'm bound to end up like them. And this seriously, it bothered him. It bothered him deeply that he's like, I'm doomed to be like these people. And, the path they're taking, waliyadu billah, is a path that leads to Jannah. It's a very serious matter. So I started thinking about what should I do. I thought, well, I'm a child. Child is not accountable for his actions. If I were to die now, I won't be held accountable. So maybe I should kill myself with suicide. Because committing suicide is haram, but if I'm not yet accountable, then I won't be held accountable for it. And so he said, well, this is a big step. It's not something to be taken lightly, so let me think this through. And he decided, after some time of thinking this over, some months later, it occurred to him that, wait, I'm now 9 years old or however old. I'm still a kid, but not the same as, when I was 3, 4 years old or 5, 6 years old, 7, 8 years old. It's a very important detail in all of this, which is, when am I actually held accountable? I mean, if I'm going to try and basically act on more or less a loophole, then I need to know, when am I accountable for my actions? What is the point at which I become accountable? Because I understand that, adults are accountable and children are not accountable, but when do I cross? Where's the threshold between the two? Big sort of monkey wrench in the whole plan. And so eventually, she concluded that, well, if I'm capable of understanding that this is right and this is wrong, killing myself is wrong and that it's a sin, something that has a very grave punishment, then I must be accountable. So in other words, he deduced that the manat of taklif is aql, which is right. The manat of taklif is aql. It's now, it does raise an interesting question. The child, the physical signs that have been assigned by the fuqaha, that have been determined by the fuqaha for the child becoming baligh, it might very well be that the maturation of the aql does not exactly match the appearance of the physical signs. So it seems to me, wallahu a'lam, that, if there is, maybe like a small gap in there, that perhaps a person reaches the point that he realizes that he's starting to comprehend what it means to be accountable before quite reaching the point of bulugh. Someone might ask, well, should he be accountable then? It seems that this is something for which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it's something that is not clearly identifiable. It's not a clearly identifiable point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his mercy has overlooked. And so, if someone were to become mentally mature enough to understand the concept of accountability and obligation, and to take it seriously, because obviously for children that's something that is not, typical. Average child is not able to grasp these things. But if someone, a little bit before reaching bulugh, because the mental maturation and the physical maturation might not exactly match the physical signs, because the physical signs are just the external signs. It doesn't exactly give us an idea about the exact, physiological developments that are happening inside the body with the changing in hormones and everything that leads to the maturation of the mind and the maturation of the body. The way that they match up might not exactly match up, but it seems to me, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his mercy has chosen that this period that is before bulugh, that if a child basically reaches the point that essentially they have the mental capacity to be held accountable, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in his mercy does not actually hold them to be accountable until they have actually exhibited some of the signs that have been determined in the Sharia as the signs of bulugh. Wallahu a'lam. Okay, so now we have Imam al-Haramain coming towards the end of the discussion on Amr. He says, Al-Amr bil-shay nahyun an diddihi. وَالنَّهْيُ عَنِ الشَّيْءِ أَمْرٌ بِضِدِّهِ. So the command to do something is the prohibition of its opposite. So for example, when Allah says, if someone gives a command to stand, this is a prohibition on doing anything that would be the opposite of standing. Now with standing, it has a number of dad. The plural of dad is dad. So sitting is an opposite of standing, as is, it's a dad of standing, as is lying down, I guess floating in the air, I don't know. But so all of the opposites, all of the things that are mutually exclusive with standing are prohibited by implication. A command to stand is a prohibition against. So, if a teacher walks into the classroom and says, all the students must stand up, anyone who remains sitting down is disobeying the teacher. Anyone who lies down is disobeying the teacher. Anyone who kneels is disobeying the teacher, because it is a prohibition of all of these opposites of standing. So a command to do something by implication then is a prohibition of the opposite. And the reverse is true as well. A prohibition of something is a command to do the opposite. So when a teacher walks into the room and sees a student, maybe some of the students are standing and some of the students are sitting, and then she sees one student, and it's a free period. So they have the freedom to do what they choose. But the student who's lying down, the teacher feels that this is inappropriate, and so says, "Don't lie down. No one is allowed to lie down." So it's a command by implication. It's a command to do something that is the opposite of lying down. So you can sit, you can stand up, you can do whatever that is not lying down. So this is how this idea works. There are some particular fiqh issues that are mentioned as ramifications of this, but they're somewhat obscure, so we'll sort of pass over that. Now he talks about prohibition. And this is something that this is a very brief text, so the discussion is very brief, but it's a reflection of something that you will see in many of the usul fiqh texts, is that the discussion of amr will be fairly detailed. And in relative terms, the discussion of nahi will be brief. And the idea is that much of what has been said about amr is sort of true about nahi as well. There are some slight differences. But simply what has been said about amr usually tells you what you need to know about nahi, except for some details. So here in defining nahi, you can see how his definition of nahi sort of matches or reflects what he said about amr. So al-amr was istida'u al-qawl. Istida'u al-fi'l bil-qawl. It was a verbal request to perform an act. Nahi is a verbal request to refrain from an act. Tark. Tark is the opposite of fi'l. Tark is to refrain from doing an act. ممن هو دونه على سبيل الوجوب. So obviously he's saying that this is something that is an obligation. And then he adds this principle, ويدل على فساد المنهي عنه. So it indicates that the prohibited act is invalid. There's some khilaf about this amongst the usuliyin, but this is the popular view that النهي يدل على فساد المنهي عنه. And again, this is the default. The default is that an act that is prohibited would then be an invalid act. So if it's a prohibition relating to an ibadah, then that would invalidate the ibadah. If it's a prohibition relating to a transaction, then that would invalidate that transaction. This is as a default, but then you will find there are many exceptions to this based on looking at individual cases on individual evidence. Then he mentions, and this relates to something we discussed before, that the verbal form of command, it has a default meaning, which according to the majority is obligation, but it has other meanings as well. Clearly, he's already talked a good bit about wujub and nadb. Wujub and nadb. He's talked a good bit about wujub and nadb, but he says here, but it has other meanings as well. Sometimes it's mentioned and the intent is ibaha, permission, at-tahdid, threatening, at-taswiya, making two things equal, or creation, takween. The example, we've already mentioned last week plenty of examples for ibaha. For tahdid, for threatening, an example that is given oftentimes is the verse "I'malu ma shi'tum." Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the kuffar saying, do whatever you choose. It's a threat to them. It's not saying, so long as you've decided to disbelieve, I guess you can do whatever you want. It's not permission. It's a threat. Taswiya, you have fasbiru or la tasbiru. Be patient or don't be patient. It's the same. In other words, it's the same. It's not actually giving them particular instructions. The point is to say that it's the same whether you're patient or impatient with the punishment. And then it mentions takween. Obviously, this is something that is very specific to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The examples that are given for this are, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says kun to something, fayakun, and it comes into being. It says to something be, and it comes into being. Other examples that are mentioned from the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to a group of Jews who disobeyed his commands, kunu kiradatan, become monkeys, and they were transformed into monkeys. Another one, qulna ya naru kuni bardan wa salaman ala Ibrahim. We said, oh fire, be cool and peaceful, tranquil for Ibrahim. And so it was. And so basically the message, the point that he wants to draw out from this is that not every command is an obligation. Not every, even though this is a very brief text, he wants to point this out so that we understand not every command is an obligation. When it comes to the legal rulings, it could also be nadb, it could also be ibaha. In fact, it might not actually be indicating a legal ruling at all, as in the case of a threat, tahdeed, taswiyah, takween. It can be used for other meanings. So he wants the reader to have an appreciation that these things can have different meanings. Just very briefly, these are examples. So we had with prohibition. Prohibition will not indicate ibaha. As a default, again, those who said that the default for amr is wujub say that the default for nahi is tahrim. This is implied without being stated here. Although it's indicated by his definition of nahi. It is استدعاء الترك بالقول ممن هو دونه على سبيل الوجوب. على سبيل الوجوب meaning as an obligation. So the implication then is something is called a nahi because it is an obligation to leave an act. In other words, it's haram to do that act. So the default for nawahi is tahrim. Those who said the default for amr is wujub also say that the default for nahi is tahrim. And those who take the position of tawaqquf concerning amr or the position of ishtirak concerning amr typically also take the same position concerning nahi. And so what we said about how to interpret an amr is true about how to interpret a nahi. There might be ikhtilaf about certain cases based on looking at qara'in. You have to first look at the qara'in. When the qara'in are exhausted, then you resort to the default for those who say that the default is tahrim. So looking at the examples, لا تقربوا الزنا. لا تقربوا الزنا is without a doubt is haram. I mean, and again, this is a problem when it comes to giving examples. Is this an example where there's no qara'in? Like, is the only way that we know la taqrabu zina here indicates tahrim is because it's amr, is because it's nahi mutlaq? Because there's no qarina for karaha? Is there anyone from the fuqaha who said that, well, maybe this is, just an adab and zina is makruh? I mean, clearly not. There's ijma' on this. There are countless nusus on this. And we come to the same paradox that we had with awamir, that in giving an example, it's difficult to give an example where there's no qarina. If you look careful at the examples that are given, there's some sort of qarina. The fact that we're saying that لا يمس أحدكم ذكره بيمينه وهو يبول, do not touch your private part with your right hand while you are urinating. If we're putting this as an example of karaha, then we're already saying that this is there must be a qarina to take it away from the default, which is tahrim. But any examples that we will give of tahrim, it would be difficult to find an example for which you cannot find some sort of qarina that supports tahrim. So the same dilemma exists. And if there's an ijma' on the ruling, then ijma' itself oftentimes is used as a qarina. And if there's ikhtilaf on the ruling, then that indicates that there's somebody who thought there were qara'in for karaha. So it might very well be that those who said that there are qara'in for tahrim, those who said that it indicates tahrim, said so because they felt that there are qara'in that are stronger for tahrim. So again, the same paradox exists. So just as we said for Amr, I don't have a problem with the principle al-Amr Mutlaq yufid al-wujub. I also don't have a problem with saying al-Nahy al-Mutlaq yufid al-tahrim. But this is after you've exhausted the search for qara'in. In both cases, you must exhaust the search for qara'in. So with that, we come to the end of our discussion about Amr and Nahi. And I just want to take a few minutes to actually do sort of a case study. Okay, just very quickly. You guys can see the screen? Okay, so this is al-Udda of al-Qadi Abu Ya'la. Al-Udda in Usul Fiqh by Qadi Abu Ya'la is a very important foundational work for the Hanbali madhab. And so it's deeply influential in all the Hanbali books that come after in terms of establishing what is the madhab of Ahmad. So he mentions this issue of al-Amr Mutlaq yaqtadi l-Fawr. This is the opinion that he takes, yaqtadi l-Fawr. He says, هذا ظاهر كلام أحمد لأنه يقول الحج على الفور. He says, the ظاهر, the apparent view of Ahmad, it's not something that is taken explicitly from his statements, but it's apparent from the fact that he says the obligation of Hajj is immediate. So once you have the capability to make Hajj, Hajj becomes obligatory on you that year. You cannot delay it to the next year. Without an excuse, you cannot delay it. So says that the fact that he takes this view is indicative of his position concerning Amr, that Amr indicates Fawr. So just want you to sort of reflect on that for a moment. This is where he is deducing that this is the madhab of Imam Ahmad. Then he goes on to discuss the other opinion, which he expresses as al-Amr al-Tarahi. That an Amr, a command when it is given, it is to be fulfilled basically at any time. He says, وَقَدْ أَوْمَأَ أحمد إلى هذا في رواية الأثرم. Says that Ahmad has hinted at this. It's not zahir like in the first riwayah, the first point that the first position that he took. But it's something that can be, it seems that in this other place, that he is indicating this. It seems that way. So how? What is this riwayah of Al-Athram? Al-Athram is one of the students of Imam Ahmad. Al-Athram reports that Imam Ahmad was asked about dividing the qada of Ramadan. Meaning, you have 7 days to make up. So today you fast a day. And then you wait, and maybe next week you fast another day. And the week after you fast another day. So you're dividing it up. You're not doing it all together. He was asked about dividing up the qada of Ramadan in this fashion. He said, "Naam, that's fine." قال الله تعالى فعدة من أيام أخرى. Because in the verses about Ramadan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, so then let him do a number of other days outside of Ramadan. So he says, فَالظَّاهِرُ هَذا. It seems from this, what is apparent from this, is that he didn't understand the order to be immediate. Because if he understood it to be immediate, then he would say that you have to do them in succession. And he would have disallowed doing them separately. He says that there's these two riwayas. There's these two riwayas. وَالْمَذْهَبْ مَا حَكَيْنَا أَوَّلًا. This case study is interesting because it gives us an idea of how sometimes an usuli principle will be deduced from a fatwa of an imam and then attributed to him. So he's saying there are these two opinions amongst the usuliyin, and we have nusus from Ahmed, we have quotes from Ahmed that seem to support both. And the official madhab view is the first one. He doesn't really explain clearly why it's the first one, except that there he said zahir. So zahir is stronger than imam. Zahir means that this is what is apparent. Apparently, this is how he understands al-amr from this case. Here, we can sort of infer from this case that maybe he understands in this other way, but it's not as clear. So that seems to be his reasoning. So I just wanted to look at some quotes from Ahmed. Ishaq ibn Mansur, who's al-Kawsaj. This is a collection of different masail of Imam Ahmed from different collections. It's a modern compilation. Ishaq ibn Mansur asked him about Qada Ramadan. He said, لا بأس به متفرقا. He goes on to another one is from the Masail of Salih. Salih is the son of Imam Ahmed. Salih quotes Imam Ahmed saying, whoever breaks his fast in Ramadan or outside of Ramadan due to illness or travel, he says, if he then makes it up in succession, there's no ikhtilaf concerning making it up in succession, so that's good. But if he does it separate, this is a rukhsa. There's an allowance for this. If he separates these days, there's an allowance for this because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَيَّامًا مَعْدُودَاتٍ, a certain number of days, counted number of days. وَقَدْ قِيلَ, and it has been said, أَحْسَدْ إِدَّةٍ, count the number of days that you missed. وَسُمْ كَيْفَ شِئْتَ, and perform them however you want. وقال ابن عمر سمه كما أفطرته. I'm not sure what exactly is intended by the statement of Ibn Umar. Perhaps he means that, that just the number of days. Then in any case, Salih goes on to say, and my father objected to those who say that it is invalid and insufficient if the person makes up, unless the person makes up the fasts in succession. There's another quote here. It's from the Masail of Ibn Hani. Ibn Hani is al-Athram, where basically he's quoting what we just saw Abu Ya'la quoting, where Imam Ahmed quotes this particular verse, فَعِدَّةٌ مِّنْ أَيَّامٍ أُخَرَ. Here we have, this is also from al-Athram. Okay, so in any case, so we've seen him making some evidence claims. All right, so now the question that comes with the second case, it, as he said, it's not so clear. There's another consideration here, which is the sighat al-amr the only evidence concerning that issue? Is sighat al-amr the only evidence? Let's take a look at, I'm going to look at a few examples from Al-Mughni. So when it comes to the issue of doing the qada separately, the days separately, although doing them consecutively is better, doing them separately is fine and valid. Imam Ibn Qudama in Al-Mughni, The reason I'm going to Al-Mughni is because Al-Mughni is a very encyclopedic sort of book. It gathers together, it's explaining the madhab of Ahmed, but it's also gathering together all the different opinions of the Sahaba and the Tabi'een and across the four madhab, and the evidences for all these opinions and the responses and counter responses. So it's a very encyclopedic work in that sort of sense. So I figured let's look at what are the evidences that Ibn Qudama produces for this issue. Firstly, he says this is the opinion of Ibn Abbas, the opinion of Ahmed on this issue is the opinion of Ibn Abbas, Anas ibn Malik, Abu Huraira, so from the Sahaba, Ibn Muhayriz, Abu Qilaba, Mujahid, that's from the Tabi'een, Ahlul Medina, Al-Hasan Sa'id ibn Musayyib, Ubaydullah ibn Abdullah ibn Utbah, also Tabi'een. وإليه ذهب مالك وأبو حنيفة والثوري والأوزاعي والشافعي وإسحاق. So amongst the great fuqaha. It says the opinion of wujub has been quoted, indicating he's not really sure about its attribution. It's been quoted from Ali ibn Umar al-Nakha'i and al-Sha'bi. So maybe he has doubt about some of those. وقال داود الظاهري يجب ولا يشترط. Again, I'm not sure if his attribution of this to Dawood is correct or not. That's not really our concern here. But this opinion is reported. قال داود يجب ولا يشترط. It's obligatory, but it's not a shart, meaning the fast would be accepted, but they would be sinful for having separated. He quotes hadith for this. Ibn Qudama will go on to say that hadith is actually not authentic. He says, وَلَنَا, our evidences, we have إطلاق قول الله تعالى فعدة من أيام أخر. The fact that it says عدة من أيام أخر, and it doesn't say متتابعات, has left it open. So in other words, remember Imam Ahmed quoted this verse. So according to what Ibn Qudama is saying, the text of the verse indicates that this command is not al-Fawr. The words of the verse leave it open. Then he mentions a counter argument, says, but it's not authentically reported from Aisha. This is وَأَيْضًا قَوْلُ الصَّحَابَة. So in other words, it's reported from Ibn Umar and Ali, but it's doubtful that it's authentic. And then he has a quote from Ibn Umar saying, إِنْ سَافَرَ إِنْ شَاءَ فَرَّقُ وَإِنْ شَاءَ تَابَ. Ibn Umar is saying that it's up to you. So this is reported from the Sahaba. There's not any known authentic alternative opinion. In any case, he mentions a number of evidences and counters to them. Some of them, are hadiths that are of dubious authenticity. And then he makes a qiyas. وَلِأَنَّهُ صَوْمٌ لَا يَتَعَلَّقُ بِزَمَانٍ بِعَيْنِهِ. It's a fast for which a specific time has not been set, has not been specified. فَلَمْ يَجِبْ فِيهِ التَّتَابُعُ كَالنَّذْرِ الْمُطْلَقِ. So it's just like when a person does nadhr. A person makes a vow to fast without specifying a time. So note here that there's actually a number of evidences. It's not just Amr Mutlaq. So there's a host of evidences here that indicate this particular opinion. And it's not my concern here, even whether this opinion is right, although overwhelmingly, obviously, this is what all four Imams have said, and overwhelmingly, the vast majority of fuqaha have said it on this particular issue. And it might even very well we have these evidences. It's clearly not Amr Mutlaq. So now let's look at the other issue, al-Hajj al-Fawr. This issue is frequently cited as evidence for this particular position, al-Hajj al-Fawr. And it starts with Abu Ya'la. It says that this is the zahir of the madhab of Ahmed because of this, because of his position on Hajj. This indicates that he considers Hajj to be that he considers Amr Mutlaq indicates Fawr. Conversely, for the Shafi'is, oftentimes mentioned that, well, the Shafi didn't understand Hajj to be al-Fawr, so therefore he must not consider. I'm not saying this is the only argument that is made, but oftentimes it might be mentioned that al-Hajj is not al-Fawr for a Shafi, so therefore al-Amr must not be al-Fawr. Again, the question is, or is this really Amr Mutlaq? We have the command, وَلِلَّهِ عَلَى النَّاسِ حِجُّ الْبَيْتِ مَنِ اسْتَطَاعَ إِلَيْهِ سَبِيلًا. Hajj to the house is obligatory to Allah from all of mankind, whoever is able. But so this is being treated as Amr Mutlaq. But is it Amr Mutlaq? Is there no other evidence or indication that would tip the balance one way or the other? So let's take a look at this. Ibn Qudama says, Ibn Qudama says, whoever Hajj has become obligatory on him and he's able to do it, it is obligatory on him to perform it immediately, meaning that year. And it is not permissible for him to delay it. This is also the opinion of Abu Hanifa and Malik. وقال الشافعي يجب الحج وجوبا موسعا وله التأخير. So according to Shafi'i, it is permissible to delay the Hajj. He has the permission because the wujub is not immediate. What's the evidence for a Shafi'i's view? Again, it's not Amr Mutlaq for a Shafi'i then. لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أمر أبا بكر على الحج وتخلف بالمدينة لا محاربا ولا مشغولا بشيء. So Prophet ﷺ, the year before he made Hajj, he appointed Abu Bakr in charge of Hajj, and he stayed back in Medina. He was at the time not engaged in jihad, nor was he preoccupied with anything else. And most of the people who were able to make Hajj did not actually make Hajj that year. In any case, in arguing for the Hanbali view, which is that the obligation is immediate, the first thing he does is he mentions these verses. Al-Amr al-Fawr, which is the qaida that we're disputing. Obviously, Ibn Qudama is a Hanbali, and in Rawdat al-Nadhr, he's followed Abu Ya'la in saying that Amr La Yaqtadi l-Fawr, this is the popular view in the madhab of Ahmed. And there's this other riwayah which is, not as reliable. So here, in interpreting this evidence, he's employing this principle. But the question is this Amr Mutlaq? Or is there no other evidence? So then he quotes a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ saying, "Man arad al-Hajj falyata'ajjal." Whoever wants to make Hajj, then let him hasten. It's reported by Ahmed, Abu Dawud, Ibn Majah. Ahmed and Ibn Majah have an addition because a person might become ill, or his camel might get lost, or a need might arise that prevents him in the future. Then he mentioned a number of reports, some of which are not authentic, but it's reported essentially from the words of Umar. It's reported authentically that anyone who's able to perform Hajj and then doesn't, then if he were to die, it's as if he's dying a Jew or Christian, indicating that this person has committed a sin. Then he makes a qiyas. Says, لأنه أحد أركان الإسلام فكان واجبا على الفور كالصيام. So it's a obligation. It's an obligation. It's one of the pillars of Islam, so it's immediate. It should be performed immediately, just like Siyam. Siyam has a particular time of the year. You perform it at that time. Likewise with Hajj. Then he goes on to say, he makes another rational argument. He says that if we were to say that the obligation of Hajj is open-ended, basically, in practice, you're basically making it something that is optional, something that is recommended. Why? Because if you can delay it, and there's not a limit to how long you can delay it, it's an open-ended thing, then, a person who delays it and then dies, not knowing that he was going to die, he wouldn't be sinful. Why would he be sinful for that? Because he did what was permitted for him to do. And there's not, you don't have a clear sign. Allah doesn't tell you when you're going to die, that you can say that, okay, well, I'm going to die in the year 2043. So I have, I have 22 years left. You don't know. You could die next year. You could die 5 years from now. You could live for a long time. You don't know. And so when you don't know, and you're delaying it, thinking that you'll do it next year, and you end up dying and you haven't fulfilled your obligation, then rationally you haven't committed a sin. Obviously, this is not what the Shafi'i say. The Shafi'i would say that then you are sinful. But he's saying that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. So effectively, by saying this, you are negating the obligation of Hajj. You're negating the obligation of Hajj. You're essentially turning it into something it doesn't make sense. It's not my purpose here to make a particular argument for a particular view on this issue. But does this qualify as Amr Mutlaq? Are these not qara'in? You have textual evidences that they are being quoted. You have statements of the Sahaba that are being quoted. You have a qiyas that has been made. You have a rational argument that explains that by making this command open-ended, you've essentially made, in practical terms, you've made one of the pillars of Islam a recommendation. Is that not a qarina? At least from the perspective of the Hanbali perspective on this, it's obvious that this is a qarina. So this demonstrates. I mean, he goes on to argue this, but he here you'll note that he made a qiyas between this and siyam. Made a qiyas between this issue and siyam. There is actually a quote from Ahmed. I've noted it somewhere, but yes. Ibn Muflih quotes Ahmed in al-Furu. Ibn Muflih quotes Ahmed in al-Furu that al-Marrudi, one of the students of Ahmed, quotes Ahmed saying, "Man akhar al-Hajj qadiran kaman lam yu'addi az-zakah." Ahmed himself made qiyas, said that the person who is able to make Hajj and then delays it is like the person who's able to pay zakat but doesn't pay it. He delays paying the zakat. So Ahmed himself has apparently made a qiyas in this particular issue. It seems from this quote that he's made a qiyas. So is this, an Amr Mutlaq for Ahmed that we're deducing from his opinion on this issue so you can see that there's something we alluded to early in our lessons, that the task of determining a particular principle and attributing it to an imam who's not said that this is my principle, it can be a tricky business, which is why we see that Abu Ya'la himself is saying, yeah, we have something from Ahmed that seems to indicate this, and we have something that seems to indicate this. In reality, we've seen, and all the usul books after Abu Ya'la generally mention the same thing. And some of the really mukhtasar texts, since they don't necessarily mention khilaf, will just mention the main opinion. But typically, you'll find that they mention, there's this riwayah, and then there's this ima, and there's this hint in the athram that seems to suggest the other opinion. Did Ahmed actually have two different opinions? Did he have one opinion when when this first opinion, when he was talking about, when he came to the conclusion that Hajj is l-Fawr, and did he have another opinion at some other point in his lifetime when he came to this opinion about qada of Ramadan? Or is it the case that perhaps neither of them is based on this qaida aslan? Neither of them is based on an Amr Mutlaq, because they're qara'in, they're evidences. So does that mean that Ahmed doesn't have an opinion in this issue? Would Ahmed consider Amr Mutlaq al-Fawr? Perhaps he would. Or would he consider that al-Amr Mutlaq la Yaqtadi l-Fawr? Perhaps he would. I submit that in this case, in this particular issue, the evidences given are not actually sufficient to establish a particular opinion for Ahmed. Now, I want to make some things clear that as a general rule, it goes without saying that the scholars of every madhab are the authorities on their madhab, and their words are, they're generally speaking, understand the madhab of their imam better than other scholars. And so anyone who's studying a madhab needs to put in the work of studying the madhab properly, studying it from its sources, studying the books of usul of that madhab, studying the books of furu of that madhab. But it should also be understood that if the scholars of the madhab differ amongst themselves, or as in this case, Abu Ya'la himself is somewhat hesitant. He doesn't make a decisive statement for one or the other. This indicates that, and this is particularly true when the early scholars of the madhab, because early scholars in the development of each of these madhabs tended to be a little bit more independent in their analysis than later scholars. Because later scholars, once as the tradition of the madhab is developing, they're more and more likely to do taqleed of what the earlier authorities have said. When you find that the earlier authorities are hesitant, or they differ amongst one another, differ amongst themselves, this is an indication that this is something that is not necessarily as clear or as settled in the madhab as certain other things might be, which are very clear and have very clear evidence. In this case, we can look at how this principle was deduced. Now, for many issues like this, it is, I think, safer to simply say that the opinion of the Hanbali scholars is al-Amr Yaqtadi l-Fawr, without positively attributing it, or without attributing it with certainty to Imam Ahmed himself. And this is one of the tricky things in usul fiqh. As you go further in your studies in usul fiqh, you need to be cognizant of this, that sometimes opinions are attributed to an imam. Oftentimes, the early scholars of that madhab themselves differ as to what is the principle of the imam on a given issue. And you have to actually examine what is the evidence for this. So in this case, if you look at this case that we've looked at, is it not clear then that neither opinion from Ahmed really gives us a good indication of what his view is on al-Amr Mutlaq Yaqtadi l-Fawr am la Yaqtadi l-Fawr? And I think that is fairly evident now. So this is a case study that shows that this is one of the challenges that is present when dealing with the books of usul fiqh, particularly when it comes to the four imams. It's not necessarily the same in every issue. Sometimes in certain issues, it might be very clear what the principle of the imam is, and in other issues, it might not be clear. And so the principle that has been derived might be representative of the scholars of that madhab who derived it and affirmed it and defended it. They might very well have been convinced of it, not so much because they found Ahmed's statements or the particular imam's statements clearly indicating it, but because of the evidences that they produced for that position seemed to also support it, and then they found statements that seemed to support the conclusion that they had that they came to, and so they inclined to that being the view of the Imam, or it ended up being the official view of the madhab, and so then becomes equated with the view of the Imam. So this is a challenge that exists as you go further in your studies in usul fiqh, that you will find that you have to navigate. But opinions being attributed to one of the four Imams, or even sometimes to scholars later, based on inferences that are sometimes disputable. Okay, any questions? We'll wrap up with that. Okay. بالله التوفيق. صلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.